All right, guys, welcome back. Let's just go ahead and get back into our game here. This is, we're starting to get into some exciting stuff. So what we need to do, just like we did with the checkpoint objects, we need to add a physics 2D collider to our enemies, and we also need to add a rigid body to them. All right, so let's go ahead and click on prefabs and go ahead and click on enemy 1, and let's add a component. So go to physics 2D, and we have rigid body 2D, and then we have box collider. And I mean, all these colliders will work kind of the same way. Circle's obviously a circle, and polygon, and you have different shapes. You can make your own. I mean, for us, a rectangle's fine. We'll make it nice and small so it just barely covers everything. We don't have to be too exact with this. So let's go ahead and add rigid to body first. And what this does is it basically allows us to move this object, okay? So we're going to be writing code that moves this object, and we want is kinematic selected. And what this is here, I want you guys to also get used to using Unity documentation, but I'm going to drag this over. And so rigid to body is kinematic. Basically, what this is saying is if this property is set to true, the rigid body will stop reacting to collisions and applied forces. So this can be useful when an object should usually be controlled kinematically, but then sometimes needs physics for realism. So for example, a human character is usually not implemented using physics, but may sometimes be thrown through the air and collide with objects, okay? So like if you're controlling your character with arrow keys and everything, you don't want physics. Like if you didn't have this marked, see the gravity scale here, 1, we could make that 0, but if we didn't have this marked, our character would fall off the screen, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and close this. So that's what this does. It kind of removes these features. So why don't we, just to give an example, put enemy 1 out there, all right? And I'm not going to have that checked, and let's go ahead and run it. And there he goes, see? He fell off the screen, so gravity pulled him off the screen. So now if we check this and run it again, now he stays where we want. So that's cool. He has a rigid body, though, that we can control and move, and, he can collide with things, and it's cool. All right, so we have that established. All right, so now let's add one more component for now, and physics 2D. And let's go ahead and add a box collider for him. And see that huge green box? Let's zoom in a little, grab my little hand here. All right, so that box is pretty big. We don't want things thinking that, like, if an arrow was shot from a tower, if it just hit that box, it would consider it being struck. And obviously, we don't want the game that easy for us. So basically, what we are going to do is just move these around until we're happy. So 0.4. Yeah, let's do 0.3. Yeah, that looks a little better. It doesn't get his sword, but it gets, the width of his body pretty good. And then the height, let's go ahead and do 0.5. Yeah, I would say that's probably good for what we're doing. All right, so go ahead and save that. And okay, one big difference here is we're not doing is triggered for this, okay? We don't want objects that are on this enemy's layer to be able to walk through them, okay? So that's an important thing to know. And now that we're on that subject, actually, we need to tag this enemy object as a enemy. So let's make a tag, add a new tag, and call him enemy. All right. So go back to prefabs, enemy object, tag is enemy. All right, and we'll be using tags shortly. Just know that they mark, a object type for us so we can find it in code. And let's go ahead and add it to the collision layer. That's important, all right? So make sure that's added to the collision layer. And let's go ahead and do all of that for enemy 2. So tag enemy, layer, collision layer. And then enemy 3, same thing, enemy, and collision layer. All right, so another thing too, our checkpoints, we want to make sure are on the collision layer because we want our enemies and our checkpoints on the same exact layer so things can collide with them. So collision layer, and our exit also needs to be collided with. So that needs to be on the collision layer as well. All right, so now that that's done, let's go back to our enemy 1. And a cool little thing here is we can take, you know what? Did I? So see what I did over here? I added the collider on the object here and didn't hit apply. So I'm going to hit apply now. And now we will see the collider over here. All right. So if we go ahead and let's see, let's copy this component. So click the little gear next to rigid body and say copy component. And if we go to enemy 2 and go to the top where transform is and pull that one down, say paste component as new. And everything gets copied exactly the same way we just set it up in enemy 1. So that's pretty cool. We'll do the same thing for the box collider. So go ahead and copy component and go to number enemy 2, and at the top, paste as new component. If you already had a collider here but wanted to, change the settings from another one, you can also do paste as paste component values, and that will just replace the values in the component and not add another box collider. All right, so let's go ahead and copy this rigid body again. Copy component and paste it to 3. And then all of our objects are set up and ready for code. And now the collider. So copy and then go to 3. And next to transform, let's paste it again. All right. So now everything is set up and we are ready to, I think we're ready to write some code. All right, let's write some code. We're at that point. Let's go ahead and delete our enemy though. We don't want them on here anymore. Everything's set up. Everything's in our prefabs. We're good. Let's just scroll this center. All right. So let's see some scripts we're going to need. We need to have a game manager, and basically our game manager is going to control everything in our game, and we're going to make this game manager a singleton. So let's go ahead and just create a empty object. So let's go ahead and name this game manager. All right, hit enter. All right, so this game manager is going to control everything in our game. So make sure it's selected. Come over here and let's hit add component. And we need to scroll down to new script. Okay, and let's call this game manager as well. Okay, and make sure it's C# and hit create and add. All right, so now if you come over to assets, you'll see that it put a C# file right in the middle of everything. We just have to remember to drag it to our scripts folder, okay? Just keep things nice and clean and organized. You'll be thankful for that later. You can either go into your scripts folder and double click that, or you can double click this right here and it will open Visual Studio. All right, so here is Visual Studio code. And we are going to start writing some stuff here. Let's think about this for a second. Okay, so we have this new file. Things are just default added for us whenever you create a new C# file. You're going to always have this void start, which is called every time that the game manager instance would be created once. And then update is called once per frame. So Yeah, so if it's like, 60 hertz or something like that, or 60 frames per second, that means it's called, 60 times in a second. It's a lot. All right, so let's think about some things this game manager needs to control. Let's see. We need to, obviously, we have our spawn point, right? So let's go ahead. We're going to make this public. And public, I will demonstrate how useful public variables are to us. Basically, we can change them as the game is running, and we can physically add objects to it. It makes it nice, and we'll get there in a second. So let's go ahead and create our spawn point. And so that is just a game object. So game object, and then we will call this spawn point. Don't forget your semicolon. This is C#, not Swift. All right, and then we are going to, let's see, we have 3 different kinds of enemies. So we need to create an array of game objects. So make this public also. Game object. And an array. So opening and closing braces. And then let's call this enemies. Okay. And then we also, let's think about, so we want to be able to control. All right, guys. Sorry, I had to stop for a second there. The street was getting very noisy, and we had to do some crafty soundproofing. I hope it works. All right, so let's see here. We have our game objects of enemies, which is going to hold 3 enemy objects, right? Enemy 1, 2, and 3. Things we want to think about controlling are probably max enemies on screen. And, as you have waves of enemies, I don't know if you've played a tower defense game, but you survive waves, right? So we want to be able to increase numbers and make it more difficult as time goes on. So we want to have this control. So we want that. We also want to have a total enemies variable. So how many enemies can... how many enemies can be in the wave versus how many on the screen. So what if we allowed 10 enemies on the screen, but we wanted 20 in the wave? It's just a little more control. There are things you might not use, but it doesn't hurt putting them in right now. All right, and then we also want to think about how many enemies get spawned at one time. So enemies... enemies per spawn. So do we want 2 to spawn at a time, 1 at a time? Just, some more control, right? All right. So now let's make a private variable called enemies on screen. And we're going to set this to 0 right now. So every time we actually spawn an enemy, we'll add a increment to this just to know how many enemies are on the screen. And I think that is good for now. Let's go ahead and save this. And I want to just show you what these public variables do. It's really cool. If we click on Unity again and go to Game Manager, and then you select Game Manager, you come over here in the inspector. Look at that. Our spawn point is looking for a game object. Our enemies is an empty array right now. Max enemies on screen is 0. Total enemies is 0. Enemies per spawn. So we can go ahead and fill this stuff in. So spawn. Let's go ahead and... Okay, so first of all, let's lock this down so it doesn't change. That little lock in the top right corner just keeps this inspector window open as you click around the screen. So spawn point, we need to drag over to the game object that it's looking for. Really cool. All right, max enemies on screen. I don't know. Let's do 8. And we'll also just have 8 total enemies just for testing purposes right now. And then enemies per spawn, we'll do 1. Because if we want, like, so total enemies, if we want 8 in the first wave, we'll spawn 1 at a time, but 8 will still be marching across the screen together, if that makes sense. If not, it will make sense shortly. All right, so enemies is a empty array, right? You see 0 here. And this is, let's see, go to prefabs. This is where we would highlight all of our enemy prefabs, and we can just drag them right on top of the enemy label, and you'll see the plus sign and let go. And there we go. So we have enemy 1, 2, and 3. And I don't like how these added because I want to know that enemy 1 is in the 0 position. So go ahead and hit this right arrow and let's click enemy 1, and enemy 2 is right, obviously, and then enemy 3 here. All right, so there we go. That's all set up, and we can go ahead and go back to our script now. So under assets, click script, game manager. All right, so let's save this. We need this game manager to be a singleton. We don't want more than one reference to it. So we're going to make one more script. And let's see, just right click inside your script folder, create C# script. And let's call this script loader, okay? Hit enter and go ahead and double click that. And loader is we're going to connect this script to our main camera because the main camera always loads. We need our main camera. That's how we see our view. That's that little white box, if you remember. So what we're going to do is we're going to load our game manager object here, and we don't need to update or start. We are going to create a public variable, and it's going to be a game object, because when we created game manager, we created an empty game object, and let's call this game manager. Game manager, if I can spell tonight. All right, so there's our game manager. And now we want to call the awake method. And basically this gets called this would get called, once when we first load the game. So there we go. And now all we want to do is check to see if our game manager instance is null. And we need to create that instance. I forgot. And let's go ahead and put it at the top here. So public static. Static's important. That means it can only be created once. Game manager. And we will name it instance. And we will set it to null right now. Okay. So that creates, the one single instance of game manager. And now in loader, we want to check, so let's see, we need to, okay, so if game manager, so we're calling that C# file, dot instance, it's public, so we have access to it, and we want to check to see if it's equal to null. If it is equal to null, we want to instantiate it. So go ahead and say instantiate. And we're going to instantiate our variable game object. Or I'm sorry, game manager. Okay, so that's all we have to do here. Let's see, we can delete using system. We're not using that. So go ahead and save that. And then if you come over here and go to your camera, click on the camera. All right. And we're going to add a component, and we don't need a new script, so we can go to scripts, and look at that. Our loader is right there. And our loader is there, and look at that. It's looking for our public game manager game object. Pretty cool. So we're going to drag. So our game manager can now become a prefab. Okay. And we can delete it here. So go ahead and hit delete. And on our main camera, whoops, sorry guys. Oh, you know what I did? I accidentally added the game manager, the loader script to game manager. Let's go ahead and delete this. My bad. Click on main camera and hit add component and go to scripts and put loader here. And then we want to take game manager from our prefabs and drag it to this game object. So now that public variable there is set to our game object prefab. So when we run this, main camera will be called and it will create a instance of our game manager, our singleton instance. So it won't be recreated once it's created. So I'm going to run it. Oh, we need to not make this full screen. So run it. And there you go. Look at that. Our game manager was created and it's just sitting here. That's pretty cool. So now our game manager gets called automatically as we run our app. Okay, we should go back to our game manager script. And we have some cleanup that we should write. We're going to also call the awake method here. So go ahead and do awake, opening brace, closing brace, and we want to check if the instance of game manager is null. If it is null, we want to set the instance equal to itself, okay? So if instance is equal to null, we want to set instance to itself, okay? And else if instance is not equal to this, so if it's not equal to itself, we want to destroy the game object. All right, so destroy. And then, so that will make sure that our game object only exists once. And then we also don't, once our game object is created, we don't want it to be able to, so don't destroy on load. And we want to pass in our game object, our game manager. No, I'm sorry. The game object that's been created. All right, so there we go. And that is just a little bit of cleanup code. Oh, it's yelling at me because I forgot my parentheses here for the if statement. All right, so basically, if this game object doesn't exist, set the game object instance to this game object and don't destroy this game object once it's created, okay? All right. Okay, let's spawn an enemy, right? We can get rid of this update. We're not going to use it right now. Let's make a function called spawn enemy. Okay, so let's see here. We need to do some logic with the code we wrote above, right? So let's see. If enemies per spawn are greater than 0, also we want to and if enemies on screen are less than total enemies, all right, then we want to spawn all the enemies that we want on the screen, okay? So we can write a simple for loop now. And let's see, int I equals 0, semicolon, I is less than max enemies on screen, or no, I is less than enemies per spawn. So once we're in this loop is going to go until like, so we want 1 spawn or 2, okay? So enemies per spawn. All right, and then we want to increment I. Simple for loop, all right. And then we need an if statement in here. So if enemies on screen are less than max enemies on screen. Okay, autocomplete. Come on. Why is it capitalizing? All right. Max enemies on screen. Okay, so we haven't hit any limits. Then we want to create a enemy object, right? So let's see, game object. We need to create a game object called new enemy and set this equal to, we need to instantiate, let's see, enemies. Okay, and for now we're just going to call enemies array 0, which would be the enemy I call horny. So we're going to instantiate that enemy for now. We're not going to worry about the other two at the moment. And we need to also cast this as a game object again. Okay, and the reason we have to cast it as a game object is because instantiate just creates a object, and we we need a game object. All right, so once we have new enemy dot transform position, and this basically is going to set it to the location we want it to spawn at, and we need to set this to the spawn point. And the spawn point we set, if you remember, we clicked and dragged it from our hierarchy into the object we created up above, which is right here. So we know what spawn point is, and we need to set it to the spawn point position. Okay? And then also we created an enemy, so enemies on screen need to be incremented by 1. All right, cool. Let's save this. And in the start, why don't we go ahead and call spawn enemy? All right, so call spawn enemy. Let's save this. Let's go ahead and try running this and see what happens. All right, well, it did create an enemy. It is in front of our castle. Oh, we might have an error. Game manager. Oh, I know what's going on. We created the prefab of our game manager. And we accidentally, well, we moved things around. I set it to the object out here and forgot to hit apply. So we have to drag our spawn point back over here. So go ahead and just click our spawn point. And sometimes it's silly and doesn't let you drag. Let's try it again. Let's just try dragging our prefab. There it goes. It likes our prefab. That's why it lost it. I made it a prefab and we pulled it from the hierarchy. So let's go ahead and run this again. And it shouldn't give us an error. And look at that. So on the edge of the screen, because our spawn point is off, but you see a sword and horn moving around. So there he is. And we have a object spawned. That is pretty sweet. So I'm going to leave it right here, and in our next video we're going to set up our enemy, and we're going to get this one object pathfinding and moving throughout the course. All right, so I will see you soon.